Wanted to acknowledge a few people before we get started. First, Ryan, thanks for the great presentation. Ryan was an executive at PG&E, a utility, so he's seen both sides of this issue and has tremendous credibility on it. Wanted to acknowledge Senator Becky Harris, who's here today. Thanks for coming out, Becky. Tina Quigley from the Regional Transportation Commission. Dan Soderberg, former PUC chairman, and Sam Lieberman from Nishi. So thanks for joining us today. Want to introduce our very esteemed panel here. We have to my left Rose McKinney-James. She is the managing principal of Energy Works, a public policy and advocacy firm based here in Las Vegas, Nevada. Has an emphasis on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and regulatory and environmental policy. Ms. McKinney-James is a former commissioner with the Nevada Public Utilities Commission and served as the director of the Nevada Department of Business and Industry. We also have Noah Long. He's a senior attorney and director for the NRDC Western Energy Project, who helped contribute to the report we're going to talk about. We have Tim Hay, who is a commissioner of the former commissioner of the Nevada Public Utilities Commission, also served as Nevada's consumer advocate and chief deputy attorney general. Of course, we have John Wellinghoff, who told you all about himself earlier. In addition to being the former chairman of FERC, and we worked together in the Obama administration, was the general counsel of the Nevada PUC and served 2 terms as the state of Nevada's first advocate for customers of public utilities. So thank you all for being here today. Let's start out with reviewing the findings of the paper that Ryan just discussed, the paper that NRDC and Solar City collaborated on. The white paper discusses net benefits to all Nevadans, that solar provides $7 to $14 million per year for everybody. There's been a lot of debate and controversy around this issue, but there hasn't been a lot of data. So now that we have this data and we have this great report, I wanted to get the panel's reactions to it. Maybe we'll start with Rose.
Well, my reaction is it's about time. We have, for a number of years in this state, had the benefit of being a huge leader around the deployment of the resources that we have so abundantly in this state. And I have, as you described in my background, been very actively involved in the regulatory process and the legislative process. We've been advocating for policies, a framework to support this. And what we saw a few months ago was pretty devastating. What we lacked, though, was the ability to do what any good business leader does, and that is fall back on analytics, on data. We needed the data in order to make a compelling, credible case going forward. We know the information is there. We had comments earlier around the availability of the resource. The resource is there. We've been talking over the last few years about 3 things: choice, opportunity, and technology. And this report, in my view, will serve as a foundation for us moving forward.
Great. Well, what do you think?
Well, I agree. I think I hope it's an opportunity for a reset. I think Ryan said that earlier. Look, it's been a contentious time in Nevada for the last few months, and I think sometimes a little bit more heat than light onto the debate from that contention. And my hope is that by bringing forward what we think is the best available data on this, we can reset the conversation and really start focusing on what should be one of the biggest opportunities in Nevada's economy going forward.
Great. Tim?
I'm Tim Hay, and I'm a former consumer advocate, as John is. He was the first, I was the third. Rose and I were each commissioners, but in the consumer advocate's role particularly, we were concerned with rates for small residential and small commercial customers. And we've got all of these numbers floating around out there in the media. I think the point that I want to make is that essentially everyone from the PUC down acknowledges that the cost study that was done originally that was the basis of this order did not have all the data in it that the new report does. So essentially it had costs that were not offset by the benefits that have been shown not only by this study but across the country in similar situations. The term subsidy is thrown around. This is really a rate design issue, and what we want to do is make sure that all categories of ratepayers are treated fairly, equitably, and that consumers who choose to have the choice can put rooftop solar on. And the act of installing that rooftop solar is a net benefit to your neighbor that doesn't have any solar, and it's a net benefit to the system as a whole. It makes for a more secure system. It puts less wear and stress on the existing infrastructure, reduces the need for future construction, and through bipartisan administrations here in Nevada, going way back to when Rose and I first worked together, there's been a consistent public policy that we wanted to use Nevada's energy resources to benefit not only our citizens, but to grow our economy, grow our job base, and particularly Northern Nevada's got geothermal, which is a different type of resource, but we've done a pretty good job of developing that. But if you look at all the rooftop real estate in the Vegas Valley here, there is enormous potential. None of us would have predicted 10 years ago how cheap solar would become, how quickly. And I think the public discussion has gotten kind of hung up on these numbers, which are somewhat arbitrary, because of the fact that they were generated from some incomplete data. And when you look at the whole data set and it's replicated in jurisdictions across the country, there is essentially no real question that rooftop solar doesn't add benefits to the system as a whole. And we want to plan a grid for, not the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, but 50 or 60 years, because as we see battery technology improving, we see more people with electric cars that can be both a consumer and a storage reservoir for electricity. And as John mentioned, the smart inverters that can actually improve the quality of the electricity that reaches the consumer. There are overwhelming quantifiable benefits, and then things that we didn't talk about, such as water, resources, jobs. Obviously, the employment took a big hit down here after the decision, and making sure that Nevada stays kind of at the leading edge of this, because even almost 20 years ago, when Rose and I worked on some of the first legislation, and John did as well, we were perceived as a leader. And this has kind of been a setback, frankly, to the state's image and the type of jobs that we want and the type of image, particularly a recreational community like Las Vegas wants to present. But the big thing is that the small customers are not paying the bill for the people that do have solar installed on their rooftops. And I think they'll be able to definitively prove that to the PUC in proceedings going forward, and that existing customers should actually be grandfathered into the old system as well.
Tim, you raised some excellent points I want to follow up on, but let's get John's reaction to the paper first, and then we'll dig into some of the benefits that you outlined.
Certainly. No, I think Tim and all the other panelists make excellent points, and the only thing that I could add is that we want to ensure that that existing solar customers and those who choose to go solar in the future are not treated unfairly. And I think this data will help us ensure that they're not discriminated against with rates against them just because they have solar on their roof. We really have to not make those decisions based upon their choice, but based upon data of what the real effect is of doing that, and we now have that data. So that's very important. And then, I would summarize it saying that, we can talk about all the numbers back and forth, but the very simple thing to say is if you put solar on your house in Las Vegas, you benefit and your neighbor benefits who doesn't have solar as well. That's what this report says. That's the bottom line.
It's a benefit shift.
That's right. It's a benefit shift. There you go. Yeah.
So, Tim, you raised health benefits, water benefits. There's also national security benefits as well, environmental, jobs. Which of these do you think need to be considered in these evaluations by public utilities commissions? Is it all of them, some of them?
Well, some of these are national issues, and as we know, at least one of the presidential candidates has talked about putting 500 million rooftop solar units throughout the country. There's probably going to be a federal role in how that's treated, but for things like national security, the way the grid has evolved over the last century, we have a lot of very big capital-intensive investments that can be knocked out by an earthquake, forest fire, heaven forbid, a terrorist attack or something else. That's a national security issue that the entire country should be concerned with. And the more that communities like the Vegas Valley and others can develop some indigenous resources to build redundancy into the system, that's important going forward. You know, impossible to quantify because we don't know what's going to happen, frankly. But it's an issue that I think national policy makers are concerned with, legislators and others. And with the proliferation of cyber attacks, over the holidays, some hackers took down part of the Ukraine power grid and things like that. So the more safety we have inherently built into the system, and to some extent the smart inverters can do a lot of that, frankly, because whether it's a regional or a local outage, they will help utilize resources that might otherwise not be dispatched in those circumstances. We all know that water here is precious, and even just having a solar panel on your roof is going to lower the amount of heat load on the house that needs to be air conditioned. So you get multiple benefits, and you've got non-recreational reservoirs that can have floating solar units on them, which are probably 20% more effective than the rooftop panels, just because of their self-cooling essentially. So, but all of those benefits, and particularly the multiplier effect of the jobs, those all are kind of the icing on the cake. This study just is the empirical, basically pretty much boring regulatory cost allocation structures to make sure that consumers are treated fairly. And as Rose, as a former commissioner, and myself know that there's, a lot of it is just analytics. There's a little bit of intuition, a little bit of probably creativity in there, and certainly a lot of public policy as well. But all of those issues are important to have in the discussion, and not just focus on these microscopic numbers that the debate in Nevada at least seemed to devolve down into, because we have the opportunity, particularly in a state like this where we're still growing and we've got good public policymakers, to say we're going to design a grid that is still going to be functional, adaptable 25 or 50 years from now. As batteries will come down in price, solar panels will probably come further down in price, other technologies that we're not even considering right now may emerge. So the point is not to continue investing under the old model and build facilities or encourage utilities to build facilities that are going to be functionally obsolete, probably sooner than we would expect.
Can I jump in on that one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a couple of things that I'd add to that. So this is public policy making. So I think there's some sense that utility commissions are limited in the kind of questions that they can address as economic regulators. And I think our analysis shows that even on the sort of most pure and fundamental economics, net metering is making sense in Nevada. There's no need to move away from it in the way that the commission did. And it's a good policy for now. Now, going down the road, I think we should be looking at other policies 3 or 4 years from now. And there's nothing sacred about rate making, right? Rates change, and so we're going to see a variety of ways that around the country emerge including in New York that was mentioned earlier, to compensate fairly the investments that are made. And folks have used the word choice quite a bit. I would add another word here sort of as a theme, which is partnership. Because what we really need is a utility making investments on the distribution grid to enable these technologies. We need customers able to make investments in their own homes, whether it's through putting in more energy efficient appliances or through battery technologies down the road, electric vehicles, and rooftop solar. And so I think that kind of partnership is really critical, and that's what we want the Utility Commission to be able to foster. They do that in the context of public policy making. So the legislature obviously has a role in this. The Commission's decision last year was driven by a law that was passed by the state legislature. They had to act quickly because of the state legislature, and we hope when this comes back up in the legislature again, the legislature takes into mind all of the context that you mentioned. So our climate is changing. We're facing extreme water shortages here in the West. Those are things that are relevant in making our decisions about which energy choices we use. And solar, obviously, and other renewable technologies offer huge benefits in that regard that should not be absent in that conversation.
And
So
let
can I-
me, go ahead, Rose.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
I want to add another
Rose
word.
and I have done this a lot, you can tell. Yeah.
And that word is change. Your original question spoke to what we need to do within the current regulatory regime. Well, the current regulatory regime probably needs to change. The current business model for utilities needs to change. Lots of conversation about reform and recognizing that we are trying to literally shove a square peg through, the da-da-da. So this is a conversation that allows us to initiate the types of conversation that will move us in that direction. And I think it's critical. For those, Tim is just dating me. Oh, when Rose and I did this 20 years ago. Well, and it was 20 years ago. And we started
Rose was
with
10.
We started with the premise that Nevada had a unique set of resources, that we had the opportunity to advance and stimulate our economy, to diversify our economy. And so we all talked about economic development, job creation. We've been looking for manufacturing. I had a conversation before the panel that gave me great hope that we will be able to attract the manufacturing, that we will have these economic multipliers all associated with the investment that we're making now. So it is a public policy conversation, but we have to recognize that change has to be embedded in that conversation. So.
And let me put
Thank
a
you, John.
fine point on what Rose and Noah said. But before I do that, everybody's thanking people, and there's somebody that I want to thank in the audience who's attending here, and that's the current consumer advocate, Eric Witkowski, who's here. Because Eric has been back in the back there. Eric has been, and his office have been extremely supportive of residential solar and been very helpful, and we've collaborated with Eric and really appreciate everything that Eric does. But I do want to say, this point of there needs to be change in the fundamental structure of the utility model, and we really do need to look at how we make these investments is very important. Because right now the model says that if NV Energy, Nevada Power, wants to invest in their distribution system, they look at how to do that, and one of the driving factors for them is the more investment they make in that distribution system, the more money they make for their shareholders. That's not necessarily a very efficient way to make those decisions, especially when there may be ways to do the same thing at a lower cost that did not entail an investment by them, but an investment by a consumer that a consumer chose to make. And let me give you an example. We talked about these smart inverters that have the ability to do voltage control. So you can do voltage control on these smart inverters in a house, in a circuit. A circuit is a number of houses in a, say, subdivision, 10 or 12 that are all on one circuit with a transformer. If you do that on several of these houses with a smart inverter, you can then, with that, do voltage control for the full circuit. And that can be done, in essence, by those consumers making those decisions to make those investments. And if they do voltage control for their neighbors, in essence, their neighbors benefit, because if your voltage goes above 120 volts, which is the voltage you should be getting out of your socket. And somebody, you should go measure it, because I used to measure mine here in Las Vegas all the time, and it ran 123, 124. When it runs above 120 volts, you're paying the utility company more money than you should pay them to run your appliances, because your appliances can run on 120, but if they run on 123, you're paying more money because your meter's going faster ultimately. So if you can control that voltage at a lower level that ensures you can still get service, all your neighbors benefit as well. So you're doing that, and you should get some part of that benefit because you've invested, right, in doing that. But another way to do that is for the utility company to put a box up on the pole on the other side of the meter to control voltage, and that's their investment that they make. Well, the decision should be made by the policymaker. What's the cheapest thing to do? What's the most efficient thing to do? And the utility has a conflict, because they want to invest on that box on that pole. They don't want you to invest in that smart meter in your house and do voltage control, because they can do it on their side of the meter and they can get profit from it. If you do it on your side of the meter, they get no profit from it. So that's a perfect example of how we need to understand how these investments can be made, what in fact the implications of those investments are, and ultimately what is the most efficient, cost-effective investment to make. And that's how the policymakers need to change the whole dialogue and the whole view of how we make those decisions.
Thank you. So I've moderated many panels before. This has been the easiest. I've just been able to sort of roll the ball out here, and there you go. So I got the easiest job today. So one question on my mind is, John laid out in his slides this amazing future of the smart home, where we're coupling solar panels with batteries probably made here in Nevada at the Gigafactory, smart thermostats, and combining those together into what can be virtual power plants. What do we need to do policy-wise to get there? John, you said they have to change their thinking. How do we do this? How do we get there? How do we do this over the next 10 years?
I have a whole vision of this that goes way beyond this. I really believe that we need to unbundle all the services that can be competitive. And we need to ensure that we can have as much competition in the marketplace as possible to give consumers as much choice. Consumers should have a choice of what retail provider to choose from to get their energy, excess energy if they don't have solar in their house, that they may need to run their appliances. In Texas, you have a choice of one of 20 to 25 providers that you can get your services from. You don't have to choose from NV Energy. You've got multiple providers to provide from. They have all kinds of plans. They have plans like free evenings and weekends. You get energy for free evenings and weekends because usage is so low. They understand that they can actually make money by offering people free energy in weekends and evenings. So we need to have those kinds of choices, and we need to have those kind of markets. And let me give you an example of a market that exists in the East, for example, that we were very interested in at FERC to make much more robust, and we in fact did by the way we helped structure that market and ensured that the market rules allowed consumers to participate in the market. And it's for something called demand response. And this is not related to solar, this is related to consumers choosing to determine when they use energy, to turn it on and off at selected times so that they can then participate in the market by reducing those loads, those peak loads, when energy is very expensive. And by doing that, they ultimately got paid to do it. So what we did is we set up the wholesale market so retail consumers could participate up in that wholesale market. So ultimately, in part of the wholesale market, there's 7 large wholesale markets in the United States. One of them is called PJM, which the name historically came from Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, because that's where it's located. It actually goes all the way from New Jersey through Pennsylvania and all the way to Chicago. One of the largest wholesale markets in the United States, actually in the world, over 150 gigawatts of energy. And in that market, we set up rules, or we encourage the PGM independent operator, because the market's operated independently, not by the utilities, by an independent entity that reports to FERC, that market rules could be set up so consumers, if they chose to change their usage at certain times, could get paid to do that. And once we did that, ultimately that market got so robust that there were over 10,000 megawatts, and think of 20 large coal plants worth of demand response from consumers, both industrial, commercial, and in some instances residential consumers, who chose to participate in that market, and by participating in that actually got paid to change the way they used energy, and by those changes helped the whole market costs reduce for everybody. Everybody's costs were reduced by literally hundreds of millions of dollars because consumers were enabled to participate in that market. And that's kind of the fundamental changes we need to do here in the West. They have a market in California, a wholesale market, but we don't have a robust one yet for Nevada or the rest of the West, and we need to make that here, and we also need to make it available for consumers at as a residential and retail level to be able to participate up in the wholesale market. And there was a fight about that. The generators didn't like it, actually. The generators fought against that because we were taking money away from the generators' pockets and putting it in consumers' pockets by consumers participating. The generators took FERC to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld us on a 6-2 decision, saying that yes, consumers can participate at the retail level in those wholesale markets.
Can I chime in on that one?
Absolutely.
So I think here's a spot where there's maybe a little bit of diversity of opinion on the panel, but I don't want to dive into a debate about wholesale and retail competition. Although I think there's no question that there's been incredible benefits and innovations from some of the work that John did while he was at FERC. It's such an honor to be able to call him John. I've always thought of him as Chairman Willinghoff. But I just want to take a step back and maybe a little bit closer to the
You can still
findings.
call me Mr. Chairman if you want to.
That's what happens when you disagree with him. So I just want to take a step back closer to where I think there is consensus here on the panel, which is really focused on the findings from the report, which is that net metering was working really well here in Nevada, and it was incentivizing customers to make good investment choices about bringing clean energy to Nevada, putting people to work here in Nevada. And I think there's no question that we can and should go back to net metering here in Nevada, at least for the next few years while we have time to evaluate the next set of options going forward. The other thing I'd say is, and this relates to Chairman Willinghoff's presentation earlier as well, which is if you saw that picture, there were a variety of resources in the map. There were large-scale solar farms, there were large-scale wind farms, and there was solar on rooftops. And we need to make sure that we're setting up a policy infrastructure to support all of those kinds of investments. And Nevada's renewable portfolio standard is broken. It's not driving new investment in renewable energy. And we've seen a couple of sort of piecemeal pieces of legislation in the last couple of years, some of them very successful, to get out of Reed-Gardner, to move towards greater investment in solar energy. And those are great, but we really need wholesale reform to make sure that we're taking the next step in clean energy leadership. And in the Western markets, and these are actually spots that don't have the full suite of retail competition that Chairman Willinghoff mentioned, we've seen some really big steps forward in that regard. So California just required its utilities to meet 50% renewable portfolio standard by 2030. Oregon just went with a 50% renewable energy standard by 2040. They're also backing off of all of their coal, including coal from across the entire western United States. So, the costs are in place to make huge investments in renewable energy at net benefits to customers and in partnership with customers. And I think we want to make sure that we put the policy pieces in place to do that.
So I absolutely agree. And I believe that you have pointed to a very sort of significant challenge, because it's easier said than done. And as I look at this audience, I'm really sort of blown away, because there's so many people here. Brian and Danny, you had solar in your house long before I could afford it. And now I can, and it's there. And I am married to a CPA, so it obviously makes sense. But my concern is that we still have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work toward educating our policymakers. And there are always two sides to any issue. Having been a commissioner, as Tim was, there is a certain amount of balance that needs to go into the conversation. And so that's why the report becomes so critical, because when you have the data to back up your arguments around moving to the next step, it is far easier than when you're just moving based on emotion. And there has been a lot of emotion in the state. Now, John and I have a significant investment in the portfolio standard that is clearly broken. It was established in 1997. It has been improved over time. It started as a mandate, a very basic mandate that said you will include renewable resources in your energy mix. We've been up and down and around the barn around whether or not that means the lowest cost renewable energy mix, or whether or not it means the most reasonable cost. And we are shifting back and forth through various regimes, the regulatory regime, the legislative regime. We have an obligation to make sure that as we try to move these policies, and I agree it's broken, because you do reach a point where you get the game and you know how to deal with the game. But it is a mandate.
Yep.
So do we have other options that we should be considering? Have we reached the point now that the technology has decreased so significantly in cost? Are we really thinking through the right policy narrative? And I think it's important for us to do that. And having been an advocate for 2 decades, I think I have a right to be able to say that. So.
Tim, Noah talked about the pictures of the big generating plants. Can you talk about some of the benefits of distributed generation versus these large generating plants? I know the report discusses this. Maybe you can flesh out for our audience a little bit some of those benefits.
Well, sure. And, from a system perspective, distributed generation has benefits, whether, it may be a hotel casino that can use heat recovery, increase its own efficiency, generate some electricity, fuel cells, things like that are just endemic to creating a system that's more resilient. As John has indicated, and Rose, partnership between the company and consumers gives the consumer a vested interest in making sure that the investments that they make are both satisfying from an economic perspective, as well as improving the general environmental profile of the state, for lack of a better term. And I do think that as consumers get more comfortable with the concept that they can control their energy usage, particularly in a 24-hour city like this, and we've done little pilot projects where you could turn off your air conditioner for 15 minutes for every hour and things like that. But the more information that consumers have, the better choices they are going to be able to make, and the lower the costs overall for the entire system. And I think, as Rose indicated, we really need to do a lot of educating of both policymakers and consumers, and try to reduce this rhetoric that has kind of boiled down to the solar folks against the utility and these numbers that are flying back and forth. But and the other thing that Rose alluded to, when we first started on this path, we had a substantial multiplier for rooftop solar in the portfolio standard, because we knew back then that solar was an expensive resource. None of us would have predicted how successful that strategy was, because it was those seeds that were laid early on that have allowed the technology to blossom as it has, and reduce the prices so dramatically that solar can be among the lowest cost ways to deliver electricity with almost no environmental downside. We talked about the water, no pollution, things like that. But in Rose's capacity, when she was running the Department of Commerce too, we had conversations about Nevada's got so much land and so much opportunity here that we really can develop large-scale facilities that are going to create jobs and a tax base and export energy to locations that are not as blessed as we are with sunshine and geothermal and things like that. So we need a very integrated education approach, and frankly, the legislative process is great at setting goals such as the portfolio standard, and then almost from every session from 97 on, it's been tweaked, and the public policy of the state has been reiterated that we are going to be a leader in renewable resources, both because it's good for the state, because it's the right thing to do, and ultimately, in John's capacity and my capacity as consumer advocates, it's going to result in cheaper electricity for everybody in the system, including the small customers who, by statute, we were most concerned with. So it's a huge educational issue, and frankly, the 30-second TV spot just does not do any justice to informing either voters or consumers, because it's just whose number do you believe, and that's obviously part of the political system. But I think forums like this and really some more detailed analysis by a lot of other groups, and frankly the business groups have as much to gain as anybody else from this. So chambers of commerce that want to see more jobs created, want to see Nevada perceived as an environment that's friendly to new technology, and that if we make a regulatory commitment to something like rooftop solar, we're not going to allow that to be essentially reversed, in one decision that has at least temporarily undone a lot of progress that we've made, because frankly net metering was working well. It was not disadvantaging anybody, and now we've lost jobs. We're kind of at the back of the queue now. People may be suspicious about coming back into the state and doing business. So we need to both repair the image and educate policymakers, and have advocates from all over the spectrum, the utility folks and others, collaborate on what the regulatory structure needs to look like going forward, so that we don't either encourage investments that will prove to be imprudent, and we encourage whatever new technologies are on the horizon, whether it's a battery in your garage or a battery in your car that can be integrated in the system in a variety of ways. So we definitely can get there, but this is not like setting a tax rate at 3% versus 3.5%. It's much more nuanced than that. So we need to have educated voters, well-informed legislators, regulators, policymakers, and solicit input from a broad range of experts, because Nevada is far from the only state that's going through this. Although if you look at it objectively, we are probably the one state in the country that has really the unique mix of resources that can be exploited. And luckily we've had folks like Senator Reed, Senator Bryan, and others, Governor Bryan when he was governor, that got us moving in that direction. We made a lot of progress, and we just need to get back to the point where we're moving forward and not just kind of arguing among ourselves over numbers that, in the big scheme of things, are relatively meaningless.
So I think we're going to do one more question for the panel and then take some questions from the group. Okay. So it seems like with the Solar City and NRDC paper that we are moving towards a consensus on benefits on net metering, because there's the Brookings paper out there now. There is other studies in other states that are coming to this conclusion. New York just had this compromise where they extended net metering. So one, do you agree that a consensus is emerging? And then how do we connect consumers here in Nevada to this process to make it happen here? What's your advice on that?
Well, I can start in on the first piece maybe, and Rose has certainly more expertise than I do, and maybe the others on the second piece. And I'll say, I think it's unfortunately probably premature to say that there's a consensus. We're in the face of, here in Nevada, I think everybody here on the panel would agree that absent the information that they needed, the commission made a decision that really moved us in the wrong direction here. And that's the law of the land right now. So, and we have TV ads every day sort of demanding that there are cost shifts. So I think it's incumbent upon us to reset that conversation and really talk about the real numbers here, and hopefully build a broader consensus. The other thing I'd say about that is that, and one of the reasons that NRDC has not been as prevalent in this debate so far is because I think we're worried about making these broad claims about a single rate structure that might work everywhere. And, this analysis is really focused on the costs in Nevada, the benefits in Nevada, and how that's going to affect customers here in Nevada. And to make similar decisions in other states, you need the same kind of process and the same kind of data. Net metering is a great policy. It's not perfect. It's just about, roughly saying, okay, we know there's a lot of benefits, we know there's some costs. We're not sure about exactly where the costs and benefits are, but this is about right. Let's go with that. And in most states where there's just a handful of customers using net metering, that's definitely good enough. And in states where the number of customers significantly increases, it's appropriate to start taking a harder look about those costs and benefits. And that's what this study attempts to do, and hopefully resets the conversation to be able to move forward here in Nevada.
I think that's a very important observation. This study is very Nevada specific, and other jurisdictions will have to figure out what suite of policies work for them. The net metering effort has built into it, at least in my view, a certain equity. You make the investment, you put the system on your rooftop. If it's sized appropriately, you use clean energy to power your life. The sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day, you remain connected to the grid. But if you produce more than you use, there is an economic opportunity for you. And it's as simple as that. If you produce more than you use and you have a well-sized system, that makes sense. One of the things that's occurred over the last few weeks that I think has added a great deal of credibility to the conversation is that the governor reestablished his new energy task force. And they've been conducting meetings and they have been substantively engaged in figuring out how we need to move forward. And I think later this week they'll come forward with some recommendations. I think that ratepayers benefit from educating themselves, understanding, getting as much information as possible and figuring out who they need to talk to so that they can make informed decisions. Knowing what's going on at the legislature, but, at the very least knowing who your legislative representative is, and being willing to have a conversation, joining your neighbors. These are really basic considerations. And if you're going to participate in a regulatory proceeding, participate consistent with the protocols, not show up to disrupt, but show up to make a constructive contribution. I think these are really important considerations if we want to move this forward. What I found during the last cycle is that the average person hasn't a clue about the duties and responsibilities of a utility commissioner. They don't know what the jurisdiction is of the commission. They don't know where the line is between what the legislature does versus what the commission does. They just knew that something had been taken away and they wanted to fix it. So I think we have to be mindful. If you want to be engaged, you have to be informed. And I think that's a very important consideration.
Great. Tim?
Well, I don't think I can add much to what Rose said, but unfortunately, because this whole issue is largely data dependent and model dependent, it's fairly easy for people to get lost in the weeds. But the big public policy emphasis of the state can still be very clear. Legislators can set the direction that the regulators need to take, can collaborate with the utility to evolve a business model that will be successful for the long term. Because, just as the cost of the solar panels has come down dramatically, none of us here can say in 10 years what a battery is going to cost, what the ability of plugging into a smart inverter is going to be able to do. So we need to have an inherently flexible system that can more rapidly adapt to change, because it's kind of like, if I invested in, Blockbuster stock 10 years ago and got the best VCR on the market, kind of out of luck now. And and we've seen, the basic, chip building technology that has been upscaled and reduced the cost of the solar panels. There are new battery technologies on the horizon. So the technology change is going to be much more rapid than a utility industry is used to. Because I almost remember, when combustion turbines started becoming common, and it was like, boy, we've got a different way to generate electricity than coal. And we're seeing more rapid developments and a lot more sensitivity around the country just about the fact that we need to protect our resources and go from extractive resources that have been heavily subsidized for a century to non-extractive resources that can benefit society as a whole, as well as have beneficial impacts, because if done right, I'm fairly certain we can bring the total cost of operating the system down. The utility will still be able to earn its rate of return as is appropriate, but the old model does not encourage what the grid needs to look like, for the rest of the century. And we need to start putting those building blocks in place now. And it's an educational effort as much as anything. And it doesn't have to be complicated, because I talk to folks, particularly in northern Nevada, and you don't have to understand the model to understand the principles. And if you've got inputs that everybody can more or less agree on, I think there's a great deal of room for consensus and collaboration. But it can't be done, when one side is just lobbing hand grenades at the other periodically. So, getting folks together and collaborating and having the state, frankly, tell all the parties, we want to collaborate, we want to be a role model for the country, we've got the resources and a lot of experience. It's an effort, but it's certainly an effort that's going to be worthwhile to the state in the long run, I believe.
Great, thanks, Tim. Before we go to questions, final word, John, on connecting consumers to this process?
I think everybody on the panel made some great points, and only what I could add is, as Chief Policy Officer now for Solar City, I look forward to working in a number of forums here that are open and available in Nevada, working with consumers in a collaborative way to bring forward this choice and bring back solar. I can see certainly the governor's task force, and I want to commend the governor for his leadership with the task force as one vehicle, and then ultimately that task force is not an end in of itself, but it's making recommendations to the legislature. So I'm very anxious to work with legislative leaders as well to see what we can do from a large, broad policy standpoint perspective to help reverse some of these things that have happened. But also, I think we shouldn't in any way, and I don't in any way, as a former general counsel of the Public Utilities Commission, don't discount the commission. They have wide-ranging powers. I think they have a lot of discretion. I'm very encouraged to work with this commission and want to work with them in ways that are appropriate in the appropriate forums. And one way we intend to, with this study that we've come out with, is we intend to file the study in appropriate proceedings. There will be a general rate case filing for Sierra Pacific Power Company by June 6th. We intend to put the study in that proceeding as part of that process. There's also an integrated resource planning proceeding for Sierra Pacific, a full proceeding, and there may be an amendment proceeding for Nevada Power as well. So all those forums give us opportunities, and the PUC has discretion to create their own forums as well to provide for collaboration and discussions between the parties, and I hope that they'll consider that as well, and we look forward to continuing to work with them.
Great. All right, we're going to go to questions. Let's see, is Tom Kaplan here? You know, you
First, I want to thank the panel. I think it's been an incredibly engaging conversation that educate folks. I want to thank you all for a great discussion. I think, Tim, you touched on this from a business owner standpoint, which I am and have been for 23 years here in the state. You mentioned, the great real estate on top of many of these buildings in town. As Rob Lang mentioned earlier, Rutgers is basically 100% solar powered or close to it, and it seems like we've got a lot of great real estate down here in southern Nevada that could benefit. Hopefully the study will make our policymakers and legislators aware that there's a great opportunity here. But the other thing you touched on that I think was really important is the image that we project as a state, that for a long time this was a place to come and or at least in the last 5 years, been a place to come and develop because we had clean energy resources and the right ratepayer structure. And you comment on this, but now it sends a message, don't come, because if you do come, you might not get these benefits. And so this is a topic I think is very important, as Rob's study has shown that diversification of our economy is so critical that I don't think we've been irreparably damaged, but it's going to take some time to get that message back out nationally, I think. And that to us, I think, is critical as business owners, that this is a place to come and do business. We care about the environment. If I'm Microsoft and I'm going to build a data center here, if I'm Switch, or if I'm Google, or I may not be coming here, even though from a cost standpoint it might be okay, but my image to my consumers are such that it might not be the best place to come. So address that maybe, Tim, a little bit.
Yeah, and very briefly, when we first embarked on this venture, many of us on the stage here together, whether it was explicit or not, implicitly the state made a regulatory compact and a public policy compact that we wanted to develop these resources. We were going to incent solar with the multiplier, and we have built on success, and we were one of the first 2 or 3 states to really aggressively pursue this, and economic diversification in this state has been. I'm from the north, but has been talked about for as long as I can remember. So I think whether it was intentional or not, the effect of the PUC decision kind of said, well, all these statutes that Nevada's passed in the last 15 or 18 years, we're just going to kind of toss them out the window, damaged our relationship, or at least our image as a jurisdiction that you could count on. We're viewed as, low tax and things like that. But the tech companies, want to make sure that if they're going to invest in a state, particularly a state that gives incentives, frankly, to bring people in, that at least the basic structure is not going to be upended abruptly. But there's, every other state that's out there that's like us is competing for new industry, and we obviously, we want jobs that are commensurate with our workforce and to develop our tax base. So we need that infrastructure to be solid enough that people will have confidence to invest in Nevada and say, I'm going to take the risk to put a $5 million manufacturing facility in, and somebody's not going to pull the carpet out from underneath me down the road. And none of these things are set in stone, but if you look at the legislative history of this issue alone, it's been almost unanimous, almost bipartisan every step of the way, and then to all of a sudden have a decision that functionally made it uneconomic for major companies in southern Nevada to continue their business. It's just that, through the business circles, I think that kind of sends out a signal that, maybe between Nevada and some other jurisdiction, I'm gonna take my chance with somebody else till they get their act together. And we have built that image very carefully, incrementally over a long period of time. And unfortunately, this hiccup is just, it's done some damage. It's going to take time to repair.
Can I jump in? I'll go after you.
I'm just going to say we took a huge hit. I travel all over the country. I cannot tell you how many conversations that I've had that have been so embarrassing and so disturbing because the image has been damaged, and we have a lot of work to do. Businesses want certainty. They understand that there is embedded change, but a significant change that appeared to just completely ignore and disconnect from policies that have been in place for a long period of time, just seemed so unreasonable. I just wanted to make that point, Noah. We took a huge hit, and we have a lot of work to do to fix it.
I was just going to weigh in with a slightly different angle, which is that you asked earlier about talking about the quantification of distributed benefits, or the benefits of a distributed energy system. And the report goes into a whole range of benefits. John talked about some of them, voltage support and lost line losses, and there's a whole bunch of them in the report. But I think there's actually another sort of quality of distributed benefit that's not always recognized, and that's something we've been talking about a little bit here today, which is the sort of democratization of investment in utility infrastructure and energy infrastructure. And the opportunity for businesses that had never really thought about their energy sources, or consumers that had never really thought about their energy sources. It was just something that came every month in a bill, and the utilities did for them. In fact, I think this is totally a great example of this. In fact, in the rate proceedings at the commission, almost everywhere in the country, people aren't called people. People don't exist. There's ratepayers. We're ratepayers. We're not customers. We're just people that pay the rates for the utilities. And now we're investors. We're partial owners. I'm putting solar on my roof for the first time this summer, and now I'm an owner of the system. And I think that it's not just about, there's a financial aspect of that. It opens up billions of new dollars of potential investment into clean energy that wasn't there when people are able to put in a few $1,000s to cleaning up their house. And also a democratic with a sort of small d, because people are able to think about, well, what are the energy choices that I want? And I think fast public policy changes. Well, we do need change. We need to embrace change. But that kind of fast public policy change that undermined that opportunity and really undermined the partnership between people and their utility company, I think should be avoided. And hopefully this kind of report can help bring a little bit more process to that.
Points.
Exactly.
So thank you for being patient, audience. We're going to do one more question, and then we're going to go to lunch. Did you have one in the front here? Yes.
The image of the old substation and that beautiful white Tesla battery hanging on the side of the house, I can't get it out of my head. And I'm just wondering, do you envision a future where houses are their own power stations with those beautiful white batteries hanging? We don't need those big giant substations. We don't even need a power company. We create our own energy. And when can that happen?
Thank you.
John will answer.
Thank you for the question. It's actually happening today in Hawaii, where it is now economical to do that. People are, in fact, putting battery systems in and being largely self-sufficient. Although let me say that I don't think people will ever want to disconnect from the grid, simply because I hope that the grid becomes a vibrant enough marketplace that you'll actually want to continue to connect, even though you could supply yourself completely with energy, because you'll actually make money by using your services when you're not using them, by taking them out to the grid ultimately.
And we've been doing that for now about 25 years. But, and if we get grandfathered in, we're certainly there.
Right.
But I really want to get completely off the grid.
No.
I'm tired of it. And I'm almost there. I'm almost there. But I want that big white battery.
No, and I think you'll be able to do that too if you want to. But ultimately, you'll see that there'll be economic advantages to continue to be interconnected as well.
There's so much aggravation involved.
That's true.
All right. Well, I think. Do you want to do one more in the back?
Hi, my name is Arlene Cam. I'm an AP Environmental Science teacher, and I just wanted to ask, what are we going to do to combat the misinformation that is going to our children, the misinformation that is going to our parents? What are we going to do as a community to stop this from happening? Because the kids are forming their opinions now, and they're forming them from what they see on the TV, and they're the next voters. They're coming in my class every day telling me, I don't want to pay for your solar. We've been trying to get solar for our school, and that's what they tell me. So what are we going to do as a community to stop this?
Yeah, Rose.
It's up to you, Rose. Tell us, Rose, what we're going to do.
I'll take a stab at that, and Rose is much more persuasive than I am. But, there are many nonprofits out there. There are good materials to educate people with. I don't think, the television media, no matter what you think of it, can do this subject justice. So I think we just need to start, educating our kids in schools, our voters, and have as many people knowledgeable to talk to your neighbors when the questions come up. And hopefully this study, even though it's fairly technical, you can boil the salient points down, but it's going to take a lot of education to legislators particularly, and just have constituents say, I don't know all the details of how you need to draft this thing, but I know what direction I want the state to go in, and I'm going to support candidates that are doing that. And and obviously the solar industry and other folks may have some money to do some media as well, but it really does a disservice to the understanding of the issue to say, my number shows that I'm going to save you $12 million. My number is going to show you that it's going to cost you $12 million. Doesn't really tell you anything about the intricacies of the issue. And the thing is, these investments are so long in duration that the decisions that we make, that the legislature makes in this session and the next session, these are going to have an impact on what Nevada is going to look like, generations from now. Yeah. And we want to have the flexibility to make sure that whatever technological change comes, we're at the front of that parade and not stuck in this 19th century regulatory mode that is totally outdated. So,
So I loved him. He's calm, he's diplomatic. I say call them out. Data versus data. We've taken the time. And I have to say, it was a big push. There was a big push. We were in a process, and I said, where is the data? I'll be the best advocate for you ever. But where is it, Marco? And you brought it forward. You did indeed, and I appreciate it. But you cannot simply allow your students or anyone else to believe everything that they read without raising the question. And I believe that you will do that. I believe that you will chat with your colleagues about doing that. I do it every opportunity that I have, and I think everybody in this audience who cares about this issue needs to do the same. Yeah. Call them out.
Well, can I just say one more?
I think we have to end it. We can't end on a better note than that. So we're available afterwards, for any more questions. The panel will be around.
Let them talk.
Just go. Let him talk. Let the man talk.
All right, go for it.
I would just say that one of the things we're doing is we're engaging students in the Greenspun College of Urban Affairs on these issues. So on solar energy policy, we have undergraduate students, master's level students, and doctoral students involved in data collection, involved in making policy decisions and helping understand. So when they're involved in the issues, they better understand those issues and they can really become engaged as citizens, but also as researchers in developing evidence-based policy. Yeah. We're doing that in areas of education, marijuana policy, autonomous vehicle policy, all of these areas that the state's looking at. So I think the other thing we can do is engage citizens in these debates and engage our students in these areas. So if you have sons or daughters or people that want to get engaged in these issues, that's the best way to learn about it as well, is to get involved in the data, get involved in the policy making. This is a great place to do that.
Perfect. Thank you. So, thank you to the panel. You guys did a great job. And there's lunch upstairs and outside.